What is going on, guys? Welcome to this Python tutorial series number 4. And today we're going to be talking about casting and input function in Python. So, without further ado, let's start. Okay, so let's talk about casting first. Now, there may be times that you want to specify the data type of your variable, and you use casting for that. So, in Python, we have three types of casting. We have str or string. We have casting for integer as well, and we have casting for float. Okay, now I'm gonna explain something that is confusing for now, but bear with me. Okay, so in Python we don't necessarily need to specify the data type of our variable. Well, Python kind of does this job for us already. So let me give you an example in order for you to understand this better. So let's say I want to create an integer variable. And let's say I'm just going to call this num1, and I'm going to give it this a value of 50. And if we print the type of this variable, and let's run this, as you can see here, it gave us the data type corresponding to this, which is an integer indeed. So Python is a very smart programming language, as you can see, because it detects the data type of the variable that we are working with already, right? So you might wonder, what is casting really for? Well, we can use casting when we want to convert data type into another data type. Also, you want to specify the data type when you are dealing with input function. And I'm going to be talking about this later on. So let's focus to the conversion of data type into another data type first. So you can convert a string data type into either integer or float. Okay, so for example, we have a variable called number. Okay, now this is a string, and I want this to become 500. Well, this is possible when you have a data entry that starts with a string variable. Okay, so for example, I want to have an addition, and I want to add 500 to this variable. But we cannot really do that because a string, as we all know, has no value whatsoever, right? So how can we basically add an integer into a string? So as you can see here, it gave us an error. And if we look at this, it kind of expected an integer, but it got a string instead. So this is where casting comes in. So you want to convert this into an integer in order for us to add this number to this number so we can have an addition. Okay, so you do this by covering this variable with open and close parentheses, and at the left side you put the data type that you want to make this variable. So let's say I want this to be an integer. And as you can see here, the warning has been removed. And if we print the addition variable here, as you can see here, 500 plus 500 here is 1000. Now the string became an integer, and it became it become a value or a number, and has been added to the 500. That's why we got 1000. Okay. Now, you can also convert an integer into a float and vice versa. Okay? So, let's say I have num1 here, and we have 50, or let's just make this 1000, right? And sometimes you want to convert an integer into a float, and really, I don't know why you will do this, but I'm just giving this an example. Okay, so let's say we have float 1 and we want to convert this integer into a float 1. So you just cover this variable with open and close parentheses, and at the left side you create um, the specification. So in this case, we want this to become a float. And if we print the float 1 variable, it becomes 1000.0, which doesn't make sense, right? So you didn't really need this, but I'm just giving this an example. You might, for example, you want to really use this maybe in your uh, accurate measurement. So you can use this to make an integer into a float. So I don't really know. But in float to integer, it is very useful. Okay, so let's say we have float 2, all right, and this has a value of 50.25 or 50.60, and you want this to become an integer. And to do that, we're just going to make this an int. So let's print num2, and you're going to be seeing that this became an integer, which is very helpful when you are dealing with divisions or integer division. For example, you just want this to become an integer, you use this to that, and this 0.60 will be removed, and you have an integer for your division, which is very helpful, right? So, okay, so all of these are very helpful, especially this string to integer, because this is very possible when you have data entry uh, data entry of a string. Okay. All right. So let's proceed to the input function. Okay. Now, basically, input function has a relationship between I mean, relationship with the print function. Okay. So, in the first video, print function displays, right? Displays the output. Now, input function obtains input. So, input function is the input, and the print function is the output. Now, for example, you want to input 500, right? Now, you kind of just do this by creating a variable first, and you have, for example, first name. You want to obtain the first name, but you kind of just don't want this as yourself, right? For example, um, as like before, we kind of just create a string here, and let's say we have rave, right? And we kind of did this by our own. And we don't want this. We want for our user to input their own first name. And you do this by creating an input function. So you create input function by using syntax input and then open close parentheses, just like the print function. And inside of this, you can actually prompt something first before getting the data. So let's say please input. Let's say we have this, input your first name, and we have the colon and the space for the user to input their own first name. So if we run this, as you can see here, we have the please input your first name. So if we put the rave here, as you can see, it just ended and nothing happened because we're not printing something yet. So if you print the first name, whatever the user will input inside of this, it will be printed. So let's say we have rave. Now we have rave here. And let's say rave works. and we have BraveWorks. So isn't it amazing, because you have the user now to input something that you want. So we have answer or something like that. You can do some a lot of things here. So you can actually put inside the print function a little message of hello, right? So we have hello, and then we just print. We have the comma. We just print the first name. Then let's say Rave, and then hello Rave. So as you can see, it's very powerful when you have input function now. But as we said earlier, you want to specify, or you must specify, the data type when you are dealing with input function. Why is that? Well, when you are using input function without any specification, the default of this input function is a string. So if you really print the data type or the type of this first name, and we write something here, it's actually a string. Okay? That is why sometimes it is possible for us to have data entry such as strings. So, for example, you want to create this give a value, okay? And you kind of just printed this first name. And for example, we have 500. It is 500, but it has no value. So, to give this a value, you can add have a variable here again, and then you add something to the first name, and you want to convert this to an integer in order for you to add this first name variable into this 500. So if we do this, for example, we have 1000, it's gonna give us, or I forgot the print function, my bad. Okay, so we have the add. If you add 1000 to that, it's gonna give us 1500. And if we have 2500, it's 3000, 3500.60, let's say about that. And as you can see here, it gave us an error. Why is that? Well, we specified that this is a string, right? And if we make the string already an integer, it's not going to be an integer because it is started with a string. Okay, unlike here, it started with the float, and here it started with a float, and it has been converted into an integer already. But here we need to convert this first to the original data type that we want. Well, the original data type of this is the float. So if you create this float, let's say 552, it's going to give us 1000.52. But how about we create this float become an integer? Okay, so you can do this by doing double casting. So you can do this by covering open and close parentheses, covering this float function with the variable, and put the int here. So you can do this now. So if you print this, for example, 500.52, it's going to give us just 1000. So that is how you use double casting. And this is basically amazing because you can just specify double data types inside one variable. So it's very helpful. You might want to use this in your program, right? Okay. Now you want to specify, sometimes you want to specify the data type in your input function. So let's do that. For example, you want your input to become an integer. So we have num1 and we have input. And you want to just have your users, let's say, lucky number, right? So to be able to make this an integer, you guessed it, right? You just cover this with the open and close parentheses, and at the left side, you just specify the integer. So we have an integer variable now. So if we print the num1, so let's say my record number is 7, and that's going to be 7. And if you print an addition with 50, and we have 7, that should be 57. Well, this is true because we have an integer. And if we print the type of this num1, it is indeed an integer. Okay? Now, how about we specified that this is an integer, but we input words, okay, instead. So let's say a power is gonna give us an error. So as you can see here, invalid literal for int with base 10. Now, all it is saying is because it is a value error. It has no value because this is a word, and Python needs an integer data type because we specified that this should be an integer. So we got an error. Same goes for the float. We can just change this to float, and it would just give us, for example, we have 50.50, we have 50.5. Now, how about we put 50 as a whole number? Well, it will give us 0.0 because as we did in the earlier example, we have num1 and we want to convert this into a float. It kind of just gave us 0.0 as well here. So that is how you use input function in Python. So that is it for today's video, guys. I hope you learned something here, and I'll see you guys next time in the next video.